Right, there we go. I can whip that away now. Right, we'll start. So, watercolour techniques. I'm going to try and do as much as I can for you all. I am pushing lots of buttons at the moment, Rosemary. I don't know what I'm doing all the time because I've got one phone, one camera. I've got stuff everywhere. Sheffield, are you, Wendy? Morning. Right, there we go. Hello, Rosemary. Rosemary's joining me on Facebook and YouTube this morning. I don't know how you can cope with two of me. She's multitasking. I think two of me, one in each ear, is bad. Morning, Jane. Right, so I think we've got two absolute newbies in the room today. So don't be frightened. You can talk, just don't swear, because I get marked down if we get swore at. And you said, didn't you, absolute beginner stuff. So we will do that, and we will. I think the hardest thing, I'm going to move my paint out of the way for a second, because the hardest thing is how much water to add. But I'll talk to you about watercolours. Morning, Gilly from Bedlington. What's the weather like there? It's lovely and warm. I was quite surprised how warm it is here.
It's very
today.
Hot.
It's mild, isn't it?
2 or 3 degrees higher today than yesterday.
So watercolours come as tubes, as half pans, and full pans. And basically, the pans is the same paint as the tube, just gone hard. It doesn't really matter. I would always recommend, if you are beginning, well, they come as pencils, but in mainstream watercolour, these are what most people would come into the shop to inquire about. Is that if you're starting, I would avoid tubes. And the only reason is, I mean, I'm using tubes today because it's just a bit easier. But the only reason when you're starting with tubes is that it can look a bit too childlike and become quite depressing, because when you're with a block, you've got a wet brush and you've got to massage the brush into the paint to get paint on your brush. So that means that the paint is loaded in the whole bristle, so you get a nice even distribution. But when you've got a blob and you shove your brush in, if you're not knowing what you're doing, you'll end up with the paint on the outside and nothing inside, so then you get blobby patchy bits and it doesn't look as good. Morning, Janet. So where I find it good is if you start with the blocks, and then as you get more experience you can know more about the tubes, or if you've got tubes already, just squeeze them out a couple of hours before you start and then let them go a bit harder, and then you're fine.
I've been given blocks, so that's handy.
Yeah, the blocks are really good, and it depends on the quality, because you've got student quality, artist quality, and like quite lower quality. The artist quality will lift off quite well, but with some of the student grades and lower grades, just spritz them with warm water first, and that will just awaken the pigment a little bit.
Warm and not cold.
Cold will work, but warm dissolves the pigment faster.
Okay.
So, how wet? Hello, Rosalind. This lovely gentleman, you talking about me? Don't know me very well. I can tell you've just discovered me. Right, so I've got a wash brush. This is a few years old now, but it holds quite a lot of water. So we'll talk about how wet to have your paper and the different wetnesses, because unfortunately, watercolour techniques, the terminology isn't ideal, because you've got something known as wet in wet, which is where the paper's wet and the paint is wet. But what is wet? You know, everything from the moment that the paper's damp is wet to someone, to the point where you could have a bath in it is wet to someone else. So I'm going to show you a different wetnesses. So I'm going to really wet this so it's saturated, it's highly glossy, and we'll see what happens to paint on there. So we've really bunged the water on, and then I'll go in with a little bit of crimson.
This is different paper from my
This-
drawing paper.
Yeah, this is watercolour paper. It's 300 GSM, which is a decent weight, and this is a cold pressed surface, sometimes known as knot, because it's not rough and it's not smooth. So that's your best average is 300 GSM knot paper.
Is it slightly heavier than our drawing
It's
paper?
a lot heavy. Yeah, your drawing paper is about 140, 150. This is 300, so it's really heavy. So you can see here with this paint, I squeezed out about an hour ago, and I'm just massaging it in, and my paper should still be a little bit wet, but I'm going to double wet it just to show you the difference. Right, and I'll try and paint a diagonal line and a dot. You can see there that I've lost the line and things just spread by itself, so you have no control over this at all. So it's a little bit tricky to work with. Also, watercolours dry 30% lighter than the colour you put on. So you might do a beautiful soft sky and think how, oh, this is the best thing. You nip to the loo or have a cup of tea, come back and you've got a blank piece of paper because it's just gone so light that it's unbelievable.
What, 2 shades lighter?
Well, yeah, well, about a third lighter, really. What's Elizabeth say? Love the video that was in the same colours. Oh, in different orders, yes. That was quite fun to do. So now I'm going to go with wet paper. So these demos will stay on Facebook and YouTube forever, as long as Facebook and YouTube are there. So you can watch these back as many times as you need to. You can see what's happened there. That has just carried on growing and it's following the shape of the blob. So this is wet paper. I've got more control than that one. And you can see that that's glossy. This one was puddled. Now it really, in terms of weight, oh, you're disappearing. I know, Rosalind, that's the problem, isn't it? It is. It can happen. Morning, Mandy. It can happen so easily that you just want to put the water on and you want to allow for it. If you're a slower painter, then you think, oh, I'll put loads of water on to allow for it, but then sometimes it can work in the opposite way. It is tricky. The water to paint ratio is tricky. So what I'll do now is I'm going to do damp paper. So I've got that many cameras and things over here. I had to make sure that the camera was just high enough so I could get a brush in, because often I poke it with the brush all the time, and then we'll have the same consistency of paint. Is that dry already? It is. Let me just it's so mild today.
Yeah, I'm hot today.
Nearly had the window open, but I thought steady on a little bit. Oh, that's too wet now. I'll let that dry a little. Can you see the difference?
It's not spludging.
On damp paper, you've still got soft edges, but you don't lose total control. Because some people, the trouble is, watercolour is the most difficult medium.
Yeah.
And I can remember someone saying to me a long time ago, but there are so many books and videos and TV shows out on it, I presumed it was the easiest. And I went, well, it's because it's the hardest that there are so many books, TVs and videos out on it. But it has a beautiful look, and it's getting that look and a glow that people want to try and replicate. So on this bit now, I'm just going to do dry. I'm going to move over on YouTube so you can see this as well. And this is dry paper.
Do you remember when I did your watercolour lesson? I found the pastel lesson 10 times easier.
Yes, absolutely. I mean,
really
it's
got into the pastel straight away. That's
such a different way of working,
I
because
struggled with that watercolour lesson. It was a deer head, I think.
oh, that was a tricky one, Hilary. That was.
It was too splodgy. I couldn't merge it in like I did the pastels. I just merged everything in, and I just felt it was too difficult difficult.
Yeah, it is. It's the control of the paint and the water, but you can
Yeah.
see how different these are. So that would be, that's known as wet on dry, because your paint's wet but your paper's dry.
Put water into the paint. Is your paintbrush wet?
Yeah, paintbrush is wet, and the paint's wet. So that's the tricky thing, because the wetness of your paint and your paper and and your brush, you've got 3 different combinations of wetness to try and each one will give you a different effect. So it is trickier to try and work your way through, but we'll go through them all. So yeah, the drying lighter is an issue, but also, I don't want to put anybody off with this, but you need to know these things. Watercolour is also transparent, so you have to put your lightest colours down first and then get darker. So if you put a dark green down and you wanted to add light green highlights, not going to happen. So you have to put your highlights down before you put your dark on. So you have to work counterintuitively. You have to work backwards.
It's almost illogical.
It is. It really is. It's a big problem when you're learning to try and think backwards. So there's a lot more thought to go into it. There are some ways around it, but generally speaking, it dries from light to dark. So that's the way you go. And also, because you're putting your light colours in and your dark colours go in last, it often looks awful until the end. And that's when people, even in the classes, they go, this is rubbish, I can't stand this, I don't want to do this anymore, this looks like a 3-year-old has painted it, blah blah blah. And then the last 15 minutes when you put the darks in, they go, oh, do you know what, it looked alright, that's better than I thought it looked an hour ago. So we'll do something called a flat wash on dry. So I'm going to get my wash brush, go into my ultramarine and mix up that runny paint. So you can see I'm really getting my brush in there with quite a lot of water. This is just a bathroom tile. Ceramic is better to mix than plastic.
That's just what plain bathrooms have.
Yeah, it is, yeah. And then a flat wash is where there is no variation in tone.
Can I just mix on the lid of my little set?
Yeah,
Because that's the right texture.
you can mix on anything, to be honest, but I find the enamel tins work quite nicely, or even just a dinner plate. Anything that's just ceramic is way better.
Oh, right.
So that's a flat wash because we've covered a large area in one tone, and that's on dry. So that's wet on dry. I'll show you the difference. Give that a clean. Where should I do this one? Here. People struggle with the wet on dry because it is trickier, because you're going straight onto paper that just is like a sponge. It's just absorbing. So if I go into wet on wet,
Surely it would
it
help to have 2
flows.
pieces of paper, so that before you actually put the brush on the paper, you could actually have like a rough piece.
You can have a rough. The only problem
Yeah.
with having that kind of thing is that with some brush techniques you can practice it and it'll be really good as the practice, but then your brush has dried up by the time you're doing the real thing, so it won't work. So there are some methods. I'll show you. But yeah, having a practice or using the back of a painting, an old painting that didn't work well, is fine.
So then you can see how heavy it's coming.
Yes. Well, you don't always know, but that's why it's important to have a white tile or a white palette, because it's the same colour as your paper. If you work on a darker colour plate or something, you won't really see the true mix until you get it on your plate. So the wet on dry and wet on wet look the same. They feel different when you're doing it. But that will work in terms of wet on wet. That's where you do things like for skies and stuff. So if I wet an area, so we've said, haven't we, that watercolour dries lighter and you have to work from your lights to your darks. So if this blue was my sky colour and I wanted white clouds, you leave the white of the paper. So I'll just blob in and leave cloud. Blob is a technical term, of course. And just leave cloud shapes. So you've got that fuzzy edge. Obviously this is a small swatch, and you'd probably be doing much bigger skies, but that works really, really nicely. If I'll move that along a bit more. Oh, my tile's dirty underneath. I've dirtied the paper. If, let's say, you go wrong, not that you will, and we're not planning on it, but it's nice to prepare for every eventuality. Let's just say you started out with nice fluffy skies, but what happened is your paper was too wet and it all filled in and you've got no clouds. There are several ways you can do it. One is known as frottage. Please do not Google it. Make sure safe search is on, because frottage has a different meaning and it's a little bit grown up. You're going to do it now, I know, but if you do it in your own time, that's fine. So I've just scrunched up a bit of kitchen roll, and you can dab cloud shapes. Hello, Trish. Obviously it won't go as white as the paper, but you can lift off, and if you don't have as much pressure on, you can get some really interesting shapes. Let me just turn that lamp down slightly.
It's completely white though, so it's...
It is. It's more. It gives you a bit more texture, which is quite nice. Or, so that's frottage. Don't Google. What does it mean then? I've never heard the term. It's French for rubbing. That's all I'm going to say. So if you yes, if you've got a friendly dog, he might frottage your leg. So that's as far as I can go on YouTube and Facebook without them banning me, unfortunately. So let's do this wet in wet again. Exactly the same thing, but you can use. Let's go a little bit stronger. The stronger your background colour, the easier. Yeah, I've got a wet brush, wet paint, wet paper. If I go in with this brush now, which is just a number 4 round, it's only slightly damp, and roll it around, you can see you can lift out, and you clean it because it's covered in paint, dry it off a little bit, and you can go in again. And with this, so this is called lifting out. It is. Do you know what? I use it a lot for highlights on things like trees, all sorts of stuff.
Where we'd use the putty rubber and draw.
Yeah, where you'd use the so if you've got a tree painted, you can use your lifting out to take your highlights. I will show you a different method, I think, in a bit. But you can keep going back in, clean your brush, dry it off, go back in, and that's your lifting out. So you've got a really different look. And I'm showing you all these things because some people find some techniques easier than others. So the more different techniques you're aware of, the more the wider the arsenal you've got to try and think, all right, this isn't working, let me try that instead. And basically you've got until the paint dries. Once it dries, that's a different issue.
When you get more control with a kitchen roll, because it looks kind of more interesting.
Morning, Liz. Yes, you can. But what I'd say is, if you're using, like, if you're doing a big sky and using your kitchen roll, as you dab, you want to move and rotate your hand for the next dab. Otherwise, it'll just look like a potato print. You know, you'll just have exactly the same shape, and then, you know, unscrunch it, scrunch it up in a different way, new dab, and just, you know, have fun with it. But the kitchen roll, some people find that much easier than just leaving out the clouds. But that gives you a much, if you look at the two there, that's still wet, by the way, that gives you a very hard edge, that gives you a soft fluffy edge. So again, we've got so many different cloud types that each way will do a different way of how the cloud looks, so it doesn't really make any difference. Some of this paper is quite wet, you can see where it's on the light. Now I can show you accidentally a different technique that most people want to avoid, because I'm just spotting it here. Can you see this one? It's still a bit shiny there. That's dry, that's not. Now if I accidentally wanted to go, I want to add a bit more to this, and I add a bit of water because I want to add a bit more colour maybe, or introduce another colour, you can see here I've got a nice hard line, but what is happening here where the paint is meeting the wet paint, let's try that here, it's really hard to do on purpose. Basically what you get is something known as a cauliflower, and it's not working, which is really frustrating. I'll be trying that again in a minute. It's still a little bit wet, I think. I'll make one on purpose here. Let me add a bit more water. Can you see how that's sort of feathering out? It's not doing it as strongly as I wanted, but it will leave like a snowflake pattern and the top of a cauliflower. That's what it's called, cauliflowering. And it usually happens where you've let an area nearly dry but not fully dry, and then you've gone in again. So when that happens, you either have to let it totally dry to go in, or make sure you do it all while it's wet. So sometimes with the skies it gets a bit scary in the class, because the skies have to be done while it's all wet, so it's like really quick, full on stuff, because you can't let it dry, and then you can good morning Ramona from Wyoming, 4:20 a.m. blimey. That's dedication for you. Thank you for joining us. I always feel very special when we get people from across the pond joining. The joy of being live. It's brilliant. So thank you for joining us, and thank you for. Are you staying up, or are you just up early? Right. So you can see there as it's developing. Some people love it. Some people hate it. If it happens in clouds, it tends to be okay. It looks a bit cloudish, but it's where it happens where you don't want it. That's the problem. So we've got wet on dry, wet on wet, frottage, lifting out. I'm going to show you. I'm going to switch paper now. Just get that one out the way. I'll come back to that one. Just a reminder that if I do get any customers, I'll have to go down and serve, because it's just little old me here. So I want to show you a graded wash. Now when I was learning a long time ago, Janet says cauliflowers only happen when you don't want them. That's true. You can't make a cauliflower, you cannot force it. It will come when you really don't want it to happen. So when I was learning, it used to be called a graduated wash, but now it seems to be called a graded wash, and that's when you've got two colours that meet together seamlessly. So I'll show you a graded wash on dry paper and a graded wash on wet paper, so you can see which will look the best. So I'm going to start with a bit of runny yellow ochre. Now I've got to make sure that this shows up on both cameras. So I'll put a bit of yellow ochre here, and then clean that off. Add a little bit of water to soften it up and lighten it, and then go in to ultramarine. Start at the top, clean that off, add water to melt it into the ochre. So because I know what I'm doing, that's quite easy for me, but it can cause problems with hard lines and edges. So what I'll do, so that's wet paint on dry paper. Now if I make another long rectangle next to it, and we'll do the same thing on wet paper. Your sleep time is a bit, oh bless you. Well, it's nice to have you with us. bit of yellow ochre, start at the bottom again, but you can see I've got more fluidity with the paint that I can then naturally blend up with a clean damp brush and fade it away. Clean my brush, go into ultramarine and start again. What you will find possibly from watching it is it may not look much different at all, but when you're doing it, you'll find that the wet in wet, the paint, cleaning my brush by the way, and then going into some water, you'll find that the paint moves across the surface of the paper easier with the wet in wet rather than the wet in dry. And the reason why I did the yellow down there and faded it up, and the blue down up the top and faded it down, is to stop us getting green. Because you don't often get green skies unless you're going to paint the aurora borealis all the time. Generally you don't want to, but I've cheated a little bit and used yellow ochre, which is kind of more of an orange colour, and ultramarine, which is more of a purpley blue. If I was using like a bright cerulean blue and a bright lemon yellow, it would be trickier. You'd still get a hint of green, but it would be more hazy. You decided to be a perpetual beginner, Rosemary. Yes. Well, you know what? There's always something to learn, and I think that's really good. That's why I've stuck at it for 25 years teaching it, because I'm always finding different ways, and then I'll think, sometimes I'll work out a way of teaching something and I'll go, oh, I wish I'd learned this when I was like 16, 17. It was so much easier than the way I was taught, but such is life. Right, how are we doing for time? Oh, loads of time.
Is that our Janet?
We've got a few Janets. We've got 16 people on Facebook today, and then 10 people I think on YouTube. It's one of our quieter demos, but it is still the Easter holidays, isn't it? Right, the next technique is the hardest technique. This is called dry brush method, and I have to tell you, it's a massive lie, because your brush cannot be dry, but it's just drier than wet, if you know what I mean. So what happens with dry brush, watercolour paper, let's see if I can get another scrap. I've got piles of, these are all old paintings from previous lessons, you see, and I just paint on the back of them, and then they go in the £5 box downstairs. I don't know if you can see the texture on that watercolour paper. Can you see the light and the dark bits?
Yeah.
So with dry brush, morning Tracy, with dry brush, what happens is you want the paint to be at the right consistency so it hits only the peaks of the paper and leaves the dimples of the paper white. That sounds tricky in itself, doesn't it? That's like, I can't do that. I will say that even if you've been painting for 20 or 50 years, dry brush doesn't always happen. And even if you've got it right on one part of the painting, it doesn't mean it will happen right on the other part of the painting. So you're allowed to get annoyed at dry brush method. So I need my paint to have a little bit of fluidity to it, but my brush can't be that wet. So I'm going to dab my brush off on a bit of a towel. Go in. Now you can tell now that the brush and the paint is the right consistency, because it's allowing me to suck that up and it's not filling back in. So I've got quite a bit there. Then, and you can only do this with round brushes, not flat, you have the whole length of your brush down on the paper. Doesn't matter which way round. And then you lightly drag. You can bounce.
You're just catching the top.
You're just catching the top bits, absolutely. So if you're doing like sparkles on rivers, you'd go horizontally. But the tricky bit is when you can see there that, you know, those lines that are formed, that's because the tip of my brush is a bit wet. So that's filling in. I'll quickly make a green, because trying to show you bluegrass is going to be a bit awkward to understand. So that's going left to right. But if I bounce upwards, look, it'll give me like a textured
Oh, that's nice.
textured grass. So you'd put that on top of a lighter green. So that's dry brush, which is, it's annoying. I can't pretend any other way. I mean, I've been working in watercolours most of my life. I've been teaching watercolours for 27 years, and it doesn't always do what you want it to do.
Use that for lawns and grass.
Yeah,
and
well,
fields.
where you want it, where you want closer texture. So for foregrounds, it works really, really well. Or for tree bark, you know, if you've got, let's make a bit of a brown. Let's shove a bit of red in. And a bit of ochre. Let's just make a sort of tree brown colour very quickly.
Because we often get mottled look on the ripples of a river.
You
or
do,
sea, don't we?
absolutely, yeah. So if I think this might be a bit too wet, but it'll be a good example for you anyway. So, you know, if you imagine this is tree bark texture, it works so nicely, but it's on top of another colour, a lighter version of that colour. If
So you do two types of brown, the light.
Yeah, or you can just use the same colour and reduce it with water. So, like, this is that brown colour. If I put that on now, and then that can dry while I'm doing another technique, I'll quickly make a bit of green again, but with a bit more yellow and a bit of water. Right, so that's going to dry, and then I'll dry brush over that so you can see how it's going to look. Right, I'm trying to fill as many different techniques as you can, because you can watch this and you can pause it, and unlike one of my family members and ex-wife, you can mute me if you need to. A lot of people would have loved to have done that over the years, but you are privileged to be able to mute me and pause me and just shut me up. So we wait for that to dry. We'll look at two other techniques which you can do with a biro lid. Now, this is a Bic biro lid. I have no shares in Bic. I wish I had. And I have students dropping me bag loads of these off, because they're, you know, you go through loads of different ways of doing things, and I've found the Bic lid the best, because the clip is soft and it doesn't snap, and the way it is, it's got a bit of a scoop to it. It's not a hard rectangle, so that will come in handy for something else. So what I'm going to do is, I'm going to go with me blue again. I'm going to go wet on dry, but we need this to be wet for all the techniques. So let me just go like that. So a largish area. So for the first one, it can't be too dry. Let's do the second one instead. So we're going to do something called bruising. So I'm going to use the clip down on its point, and this is really good for making dark lines, so branches, twigs, that kind of thing. The only problem is that once you've put it on, whatever you put over the top will have those lines through it, because you're basically bruising the paper. But can you see you're getting dark outlines, and you can't get rid of them?
Embossing, we get light lines.
Yes, because you're skimming over. Well, you can get white lines with the wonderful Bic if you use the scoopy bit of the clip.
Yeah.
If, as your paper is starting to dry, you can just scrape out, and that's known as sgraffito. So I could do silver birch trunks. Now you'll know if it's too wet because it'll fill back in, so you have to catch it just at the right time. That's clever, isn't it?
That is nice silver birch, yeah.
But you have to wait. A lot of it is down to how wet your paper is and how patient you are, and how not to use a what's that, Jane? Just sent a canvas for local elections away. Told him I'm far too busy in the middle of an online tutorial. Oh, that's good, Jane. Thank you very much. We're politically neutral in this room.
It depends which way you turn it. So you scoop it with silver birch. And
Yeah. So
you're
yeah.
pressing it.
So yeah, because you know you've got that groove in there. You're sort of like scooping it out.
Yeah.
But for the darker line, you're just using the clip on its own. If you've got some paintbrushes have a natural, like some with a plastic handle, will have a diagonally cut stem, if you like, of the handle. You can use that for scratching in. I've known some artists that will keep one fingernail longer to scratch through. So there's lots. So you've got sgraffito, which is the scratching out, and bruising, which is the indenting. It's morning, Carol. Thank you, Elizabeth. It is. Do you know what? It is good fun to practice, and unfortunately, because I'm exactly the same, these things are the stuff that you won't do necessarily because you just want to get on and paint, don't you? But it is good having a bit of a practice every now and again. Now that I think is dry, so let's do that dry brush again on that brown. We'll go downwards now. Will it work this time? Yes. It's still a little bit damp, but you can see it's giving us texture. Let's clean that. Got 10 minutes left.
I think it would have been easier for me as a beginner to start with a landscape of woodland
Yes.
than trying to do an animal's
You-
face.
yes.
It lightheaded, didn't it?
It did, yeah. I think landscapes. If you can find one of our lessons that is sort of landscape-ish with something to do
That'd
with
be
skies,
easier,
it
not
is
with an
much
animal.
easier. Absolutely.
The animal's fine with pastel.
Let's try and dry brush. Yes, I think that was a
But
big
the
thing.
pastel animal was dead easy, wasn't it? Because
Oh,
it was
yeah, you did the
layers like
horse.
horse's head.
Yeah. There you go. Look, so you can see the different textures that you can get because you won't necessarily be working on
That's a
white.
round brush.
A round brush on its side. Yeah, now the reason why you don't want to use a flat brush, which you'd think, well, I'll just use a flat brush because it's the broadness. It's not, because we've come so far in technology that nylon brushes are made like real hair, so they are hollow with scales. So each strand isn't necessarily just a stick of nylon. So if you imagine all of these as hollow little receptacles, when you tip your flat brush up like that, it's going to have all of that paint that's in the hollow receptacles coming out, so it won't be dry. So by using the lengths, the bristle on its side, you've only got the moisture and the paint that's on the outside of the bristles rather than in, because you can see that's very different. And if I'll show you what will happen if it's too wet, but you'll know what will happen. That. So you might get it, or you might start a bit lumpy, and then as your paint runs out, you'll get wet in wet. That might be a useful technique for something. Who knows? All right, how are we doing? Oh, I want to show you glazing as well. Let me put a colour down, and then that can dry, and I'll do something else. Let me put cadmium yellow colour down. Let's mix that up. So I've got a nice yellow square. Now, can you see how the paper is repelling a little bit when I'm adding the water? Can you see these little patches? That is down to me. That's my hand, the oil off my skin, creating a barrier on the watercolour paper. Obviously, we're kind of water-based. So, oh, I don't know why. I'm still live, Rosemary. I can see your comment. Animals do your head when you're trying to do watercolour.
I'm not
Do your
the
head
only
in.
one.
No. So there we go. I can redo my fill in my fingers. So try not to touch your paper as much. The other thing I will say about your tutor, that your paper, is don't keep your pads in a conservatory or your boot of your car in between classes or anything, because what will happen is that the damp air can kind of affect the surface of your paper. So the edges of your paper will, oh thank you Jean, the edges of your paper will go mottled, and it will be like a sponge, so you'll only have the inside of your paper to work with, and you won't know that until you start painting. It'll just go really, really mottly and weird. Just check any more comments. Good. Okay, So a few more minutes. I'll wait for that to dry. Let me think. What else can I?
Can I just ask about
Yes.
the water?
Yes.
Your brush. Does it not get mucky and
Good question. Yes, it does. But in a 2-hour class here, we never change the water. Because if you think you've got to work from light to dark, so your water's getting darker, but so is your paint. So it shouldn't matter. But I did a little reel on this the other day, actually. Because people go, oh, I need to change my water every 30 seconds.
Well, you just have lots of little pots.
No.
Water.
You can if you want, but it's a waste of water, and with Thames Water being how they are, we might as well try and conserve it. So basically, if you've got your water jar, what you don't want is pigment is heavier than water. So if you want cleanish water, you just tip in the top ½ inch and you'll always have cleaner water. Whereas if you keep ramming your brush down into it, you're going to stir up your sludge. So if I clean my brush, I go about halfway down and give it a little bit of a twist on the side, let it fall, and then your brush is going to be clean and wet. So you've seen the colour of my water there, that's purple. You know? And this is quite a strong pigment. So you could change your water. Or if I was going to do something and then my water was really dirty but I needed something lighter. So if I was in acrylics, working in acrylics, and I wanted some white highlights at the end, or white glazes, I would probably use clean water for that. But generally, don't matter. As long as you know how to use your... Oh, Rosemary, I don't know what's going on with Facebook then. Anything can happen here. What do I want to show you? Any other questions so far? Glazing. Yes, that's still wet, so I can't show you the glaze. With a brush like this, I think this one is a squirrel, but they have now started doing fake squirrel, because squirrel's quite hard to get. They're a wash brush, but with a really good point. And what that means is, I'll go into the crimson just for a minute, is that you can cover, well, let's that dry over there, and let's go back to this one for a second. So you've got really broad areas you can cover, but equally, with very little pressure, I can get thin lines, thicker lines, thicker lines. I can create petal shapes if I want to. Yeah, just by varying the pressure. I can do grass. And if I dry the brush a little bit, stab it, pretend it's somebody I don't like very much, and I've got a right manky ended brush. It won't ruin your brush. I've got fur, feathers or grass, you know, just with that one brush. So the real squirrel, sorry anybody online if you like, I love squirrels, they cost, this costs about 30 quid, this brush. The Sable-esque version that we sell downstairs for the same sort of size is half the price, and it does exactly the same job. So that is, get to know your brushes. You can use, you know, I'm just waiting for the thing to dry. Even with the number 4 round on its side wet, you've got quite a broad area. You can get thin lines, medium lines, and you can get quite a lot with brushes. So I tend to, in my watercolours, and I think we've got them online on our online shop on offer, which is these 3 brushes. This is a miniature painting brush, size 1, so it's very fine, but it's really easy to hold. Those, and then randomly and occasionally I'll use a rigger brush, which is for, I did a reel on that the other day, long thin lines, branches and trees. But for any A4 size painting or smaller, they're the only brushes I use. If I'm feeling like a show off, I might only use that one big brush, because I know I've got a variation of lines. Right, now has that dried, or do I need the hairdryer on it? Let me get the hairdryer just to double check.
I think that the set my friend gave me
Yeah,
was that being a medium sized brush. It's just the one who's got the small
Yeah.
size.
yeah. I would say medium. I mean, you want a decent width brush for a wash.
Turn it around and play with
Yeah,
it.
yeah, because you can get these brushes. Well, I've only got a big one here. Down to 1 inch. These are called hake or hake brushes, and they're made of goat hair, and they're really absorbent. But you could literally cover your whole table with water if you soak that enough. So it's hard. The squirrel brush is the size 2 is the best size. It's more workable. I have used a size 4, but I know what I'm doing. But if you've never used one, use a size 2. And
Or an imitation squirrel.
the imitation squirrel is just as good. It's called Sablesque by ProArty. We go through a lot of those in the shop downstairs. Right, and it's more of a lighter brown bristle. So I'm going to do a glaze for the last couple of seconds. So I'm going to mix up ultramarine, quite runny on my brush. And a glaze is when you put another colour on top of another colour, and it will change colours. So you can see there's the blue. And this is what I mean about watercolours going from light to dark. You can get a much better effect that way. And you can mix colours without actually mixing colours. You can layer your glazes, and as long as you're quick, it will give you sort of more of a dark green than a blue.
So if you let it dry, it would give you the blue.
Yes, you've always got to let that undercolour dry before you put the other. But the problem is, if say you're a bit heavy-handed and you're a bit sloppy with your work, and you linger a bit, what can happen is you end up lifting off that colour, and you might go through both colours back to white.
What was too much water?
Too much water, or you basically, by fiddling and faffing, you end up wearing that top colour off. So sometimes it's best not to fiddle and faff. So that's a very quick rundown of watercolour techniques. Hopefully you found that useful, and as I say, these videos will stay on Facebook and YouTube forevermore. Our next demo is the 4th of May, and it's buildings in pen and ink. So we'll be doing permanent pen buildings. So thank you very much for your company. I hope you found that useful. Take care, and I will see you all soon.
Are we
Bye
doing
bye.
perspective next?